Adrienne from Bell's Chapel. She said, hold on just a moment. So a few minutes later, Bob Moss comes on the phone and he said, good morning, Pastor Adrienne. How are you? I've heard a lot about your ministries. I have been intending to come to see you. He said, what do I owe to this call? I said, Bob, I'm glad to meet you by phone. I hope to one day meet you in person. I said, I hear that the Sunnyside Road Church of God property is empty, and the Lord has placed on my heart to plant a church. And I was just wondering if that's the place where I'm supposed to plant the church. He said to me, he said, I'll meet you Tuesday. I'll come to your church Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and we'll talk about it then. Sure enough, that Tuesday, Bob Moss and Renee showed up at the church. They came into my office. We prayed. I took him around the church, showed him the ministries, showed him the daycare, showed him the church. I think there were some people there picking up food from the food pantry. And then we went into my office and we began to talk. We talked about the ministries, and then he said, well, tell me about the church plan. And I told him how December 31st, before our watch meeting service, that the Lord spoke to me in my bathroom and said to me, I want you to plant a church. I sat there and I listened. I got up, I went to my office. The Lord said, I want you to plant the church. I got up from my desk, I went to my altar, I knelt at my altar. The Lord said, I want you to plant a church. So when I got to watch meeting service at Bell's Chapel, I told Bell's Chapel what the Lord had told me. They said, well, Bishop, does that mean you're leaving us? And I said, no, the Lord didn't say leave. He just told me to plant a church. I said, I don't know how. I never planted a church before, and I don't know where, or I don't know, and I don't know when. I just know that the Lord has said, plant the church. I began to think about it and pray about it after that night. I thought maybe, well, I'll plant it in Hallville, or I'll plant it somewhere on the east side of Indianapolis. And then after a while, I just threw it to the back of my mind until that day at Sunnyside, until that day at Golden Corral, when Dan said to me, do you know the Sunnyside Road Church of God property is empty? So I told Bob that I was going to name it Abounding Grace Church of God. Bob said to me, he said, well, your timing is impeccable because the board meets on Thursday. And had you not called me when you called me, the board would not meet again for 4 months. He said, I'm going to recommend to the board that you be allowed to plant Abounding Grace Church of God at the Sunnyside Road property. He said, I'll give you a call. The board meets Thursday at 4. Thursday, I will call you about 4 o'clock Thursday evening. So we shook hands, we prayed again, we hugged, and he left. From that point on, I continued to pray about it. Thursday, I got up anxiously, awaiting a call from Bob. I went to my office. I called Indiana Ministries. I said, could you tell me what time the board meets? And they said to me, they're meeting now. I called back about 1 o'clock. I said, can you tell me if the board meeting is over? They said, no, they're still in the meeting. I called back at 4 o'clock. They were still in the meeting. And I didn't get a call from Bob at 6 o'clock when I left the church that Thursday. I went home thinking that maybe he had called my house and left a message on my phone at home. Got home, checked the messages, no message from Bob. So I thought to myself, well, maybe they said no. That night, as I laid in my bed, I said to the Lord, I said, Lord, if I'm supposed to plant the church at Abounding Grace Church of God at the Sunnyside Road property, then allow the vote to be unanimous. I fell off to sleep. That next morning I got up and I went to Bell's Chapel, anxious, and I called Indiana Ministries as soon as I sat down to my desk. I asked for Bob. They said, hold on just a moment. They asked who was calling. I said, this is Pastor Adrienne. They came back to the phone and said, Bob said he will call you mid-morning. And I'm thinking to myself, why can't he talk to me now? Why can't he tell me yes or no now? How long would it take for him to tell me yes, no, maybe? So I said, okay, thank you. I got off the phone. I continued to sit at my desk, Then I began to pace the floor. Then I walked around to Miss Vicky's office and I said, can you tell me what time mid-morning is? She said, well, Bishop, that's between 11 and 12. And I said, oh my goodness, I can't sit here that long. Waiting by the phone, just waiting. I said, I'm going to ride up to Washington Square and I'll be back. So I got in my car and I rode up to Washington Square Mall. And as soon as I got there, the phone rang. They said, Bishop, you have company here in the building. And I said, who is it? And they said, Bob Moss. I said, tell him I'll be there in 7 minutes. I jumped in my car, flew back down the street. When I walked up the stairs to Bell's Chapel, there was Bob with that big grin of his. He had a man named Jeff White with him, the assistant minister. I walked in, I greeted them both, and Bob handed me a letter. I said, oh, you couldn't tell me no in person, you had to write it. And he chuckled and continued talking to Miss Vicky and Miss Tanika and other women in the daycare. He said, read this. I went into my office, opened the letter. The first sentence in the letter said, Dear Pastor Adrienne, the board has voted unanimously for you to plant Abounding Grace Church of God at the Sunnyside Road property.